Jacob Hartwell had chosen solitude like a man chooses a religion. At 6'9" and broad as a barn door, he'd learned early that his size made people nervous, made them whisper and cross streets to avoid him. So 15 years ago, he de-built his cabin deep in the Montana wilderness where the only eyes that watched him belonged to deer and eagles. And that suited him just fine. He'd convinced himself that loneliness was simply the price of peace, and he'd been willing to pay it. The winter of 1873 came early and brutal. Jacob had just finished securing his horses in the barn when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost mistook it for wind. But then it came again, a desperate scratching at his door, weak and irregular. He grabbed his rifle, instincts honed by years of frontier living, and threw open the heavy wooden door. She collapsed at his feet, a girl no more than 14, her lips blue with cold, her deerskin dress torn and crusted with ice. She looked up at him with eyes glazed by hypothermia and whispered something in a language he didn't understand before. Her head fell forward. Jacob stood frozen, his mind racing through a dozen reasons to close the door and pretend he'd never heard that scratching. The frontier had taught him that involvement meant complications, and complications meant danger. But her hand, small and trembling, reached out and grasped the edge of his boot. That simple gesture shattered something inside him. He scooped her up as gently as his massive hands could manage, shocked at how light she was, how fragile. He carried her to the fireplace, wrapped her in every blanket he owned, and began the careful work of warming someone who'd nearly frozen to death. He'd seen men die from warming too quickly, their hearts giving out from the shock. Through the night, Jacob worked. He heated stones and placed them carefully around her, made weak broth that he spooned between her cracked lips, rubbed her frozen fingers and toes to restore circulation. As dawn broke, her eyes finally fluttered open. She stared at him, and he saw fear flash across her face before something else replaced it, perhaps recognition that he'd helped her, or perhaps simple exhaustion. She spoke again in her native tongue, and though he couldn't understand the words, he heard the question in her voice. Jacob held up his hands in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture and said slowly, "You're safe here," he pointed to himself. "Jacob," then gestured to her with a questioning look. She studied him for a long moment before answering, "Aida?" The name sounded like music, like water over stones. Over the next 3 days, as the blizzard raged outside, Jacob learned Aida's story through gestures, drawings in the ash of the hearth, and the few English words she knew. Her village had been attacked by soldiers. She'd run until her legs gave out, until the cold had nearly claimed her. She drew a map showing her people were 2 days north, if they'd survived, if they were still there. She needed to return to them, but the snow made travel impossible. Jacob found himself in unfamiliar territory. He'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this, caring about another person's fate, feeling responsible for someone other than himself. Yet each morning when he woke to find Aida carefully tending his fire or attempting to cook breakfast with his meager supplies, something in his chest tightened. She was trying to repay his kindness in the only ways she could, and her quiet dignity moved him in ways he couldn't name. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Aida stood at the window, clearly torn between gratitude and desperate need to find her family. Jacob knew what he had to do, even as every self-preserving instinct screamed against it. He began packing supplies, loading his strongest horse, preparing for a journey that could cost him everything. Aida watched, confused, until he pointed to her, then to the supplies, then north. Her eyes widened with understanding, and tears spilled down her cheeks. They traveled for 2 days through snow-laden wilderness. Jacob navigated by landmarks he barely knew, trusting Aida's gestures and his own frontier instincts. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the Crow village below, smoke rising from lodges, people moving about, Aida let out a cry of joy. But as they descended, Jacob felt dread pooling in his stomach. He was a white man bringing back a native girl. History had taught him how that story usually ended. Warriors surrounded them immediately, weapons drawn. An older woman pushed through the crowd, and Aida leaped from the horse, running into her arms, both of them sobbing. Through Aida's rapid explanations and gestures toward Jacob, the story emerged. The chief, a weathered man with intelligent eyes, approached. Jacob dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, meeting the chief's gaze with as much respect as he could convey. What happened next stunned Jacob more than anything in his solitary life. The chief placed both hands on Jacob's shoulders and spoke in halting English, learned from traders. "You saved daughter of my sister. You brought her home through danger. You are brave man. Good man." Then the chief did something that made Jacob's throat tighten. He gestured to the village and said, "You have no family? Now you do. You always have home here. Always have people." Jacob looked around at the faces that had been hostile moments before, now softening with understanding. Aida stood with her aunt, smiling at him through her tears, and he realized that the very thing he'd been running from for 15 years, connection, belonging, the messy complexity of caring and being cared for, was exactly what his soul had been starving for. He'd thought saving Aida was a simple act of human decency, one good deed in a lifetime of isolation. But she had saved him too, shown him that walls built from fear and pain could come down, that a giant who thought himself too different to belong could find family in the most unexpected places. That night, as he sat by the fire in the village, surrounded by people whose language he barely spoke but whose warmth he could feel, Jacob Hartwell finally understood what it meant to come home.